The courthouse door swung open with a resounding thud, and a hush fell over the onlookers gathered in the long, chilly hallway. Clusters of people, lawyers in tailored suits, anxious relatives wringing their hands, reporters checking their camera batteries, suddenly stopped talking. Time seemed to slow as a scrawny, disheveled man was ushered in by two bailiffs. His clothes were threadbare, his hair matted. A plastic bag containing his few possessions rattled at his side. He walked with uneven steps as if every movement pained him. This man was Miles Donovan. He looked older than his 42 years, with dark circles under his eyes and lines etched across a face that had known far too many sleepless nights on the cold concrete of the city's back alleys. The smell of unwashed fabric and the faint odor of despair clung to him like a second skin. Yet, there was something in his eyes, an unwavering calm. No matter how destitute his appearance, there was a silent steadiness about him, as if he carried an inner world that no one else could touch. "Miles Donovan," the court clerk called, motioning for him to enter the courtroom. "You're up next." Onlookers in the gallery craned their necks to get a better view. Some snickered, others just stared, but the entire room seemed charged with an inexplicable energy. Miles's shoulders rose and fell in one slow breath as he stepped forward, the bailiffs keeping a firm but not aggressive grip on his arms. He didn't resist. He simply allowed himself to be guided. At the head of the courtroom sat Judge Clara Aldridge. Her reputation for zero tolerance was widely known across the state. She had presided over countless cases and had a penchant for letting her personal judgments slip into her comments, especially when confronted with those she deemed irresponsible or beneath the moral standard. The judge wore her dark hair in a tight bun, her piercing brown eyes scanning the faces before her like a hawk searching for prey. The moment she laid eyes on Miles, her brow rose in immediate disapproval. It was as though she could smell his poverty, his humiliation, and was already poised to condemn him based on that alone. She tapped her gavel twice, a sharp clack echoing through the silent room. "Order," she snapped. "We will now address the case of the state Mrs. Miles Donovan." Miles shuffled forward, his head bowed slightly. Yet he did not look meek, rather he looked contained, like a man who had learned a million ways to fold himself into small spaces simply to survive. The judge peered down at the file in front of her, then raised her gaze to size him up directly. Her next words came out dripping with condescension. "Miles Donovan," she said, her voice resonating across the hush. "You are charged with trespassing on private property, resisting arrest, and destruction of corporate assets." A wry grin tugged at her lips. "But from the looks of you, Mr. Donovan, I doubt you have a single asset to your name." A few snickers floated around the gallery. Miles said nothing. The judge let out a short, derisive laugh that ricocheted through the court. "Homeless, jobless, and you allegedly tried to break into the headquarters of Apogee Tech, one of the largest tech corporations in the country?" She glanced at the prosecuting attorney, her eyebrow cocked. "I'm sorry, do we truly have the right person here? Was he planning to steal a microchip to pawn for a sandwich?" The prosecution, a man in a crisp navy suit, let out a mild chuckle. Miles still did not speak. He merely studied the judge, waiting, as if measuring something behind her gaze. That silent scrutiny seemed to unnerve her. "Mr. Donovan," she snapped, "you care to tell the court what you were doing inside a building you had no business entering? Or are you about to spin some yarn about being lost and hungry?" The entire gallery leaned in, expecting some feeble excuse, some sob story, but all that followed was a moment of tense silence. And then, quietly but firmly, Miles answered. "I was gathering evidence." The judge blinked, perplexed by the steady tone in Miles's voice. Her confusion quickly hardened into annoyance. "Evidence?" She let out a snort. "Evidence of what, exactly?" Miles opened his mouth to respond, but the prosecuting attorney, Philip Hurst, interjected with a theatrical sigh. Your Honor, Mr. Donovan has a history of erratic behavior. We have reason to believe he intended to vandalize Apogee Tech's property. Security footage shows him attempting to pry open a maintenance door after hours. The defense can't possibly claim innocence in the face of such direct evidence. The judge nodded, her earlier mockery returning in full force. Indeed, she said. It's not often we see a man in ragged clothing wandering around a high-security building for altruistic reasons. She flicked a dismissive hand. Let's make this quick. We have more pressing matters on the docket today than petty trespassing. At that point, a tall, bespectacled woman at the defense table stood up. She wore a second-hand gray blazer and clutched a pile of documents with anxious fingers. This was Felicity Park, Miles's appointed public defender. She cleared her throat, pushing up her glasses as she tried to keep her composure. Your Honor, she began, Mr. Donovan asserts there's a significant reason behind his intrusion. He claims he was searching for digital proof that Apogee Tech has been engaged in systematic data manipulation which affects thousands of unsuspecting citizens. The judge's eyebrows shot up in a mocking arch. The gallery erupted into whispers. Data manipulation? She scoffed. And you expect me to believe a homeless man was in possession of advanced knowledge about Apogee Tech's dealings? Felicity's voice trembled slightly. Well, Mr. Donovan has indicated he possesses certain expertise that might be relevant. Expertise? The judge's laughter filled the room anew. Please, this is the most absurd hearing I've had in months. Mr. Donovan's charges are straightforward. I see no reason to entertain fantasies. Miles was still calm, a silent observer in the storm of ridicule swirling around him. A small muscle twitched in his jaw, but he said nothing in his own defense. Not yet. Judge Aldridge leaned forward, eyes narrowing. I'm going to give you one more chance, Mr. Donovan. Either explain yourself properly or watch me sign an order that places you behind bars for the next few years. The open threat hung like a guillotine over Miles's head. The air crackled with anticipation. Several spectators, sensing drama, edged to the front of their seats. This was the hook everyone had been waiting for, the moment of truth, or at least a pathetic attempt from the accused to avoid prison time. But Miles lifted his head, revealing a gaze that was suddenly alert and focused. Your Honor, he said, his voice echoing across the hush, I do have evidence. Data logs, encrypted files, whistleblower emails, and I intended to retrieve them from Apogee Tech to prevent a massive cover-up. A wave of murmurs passed through the crowd. Even the bailiffs exchanged uncertain glances. The judge tried to dismiss the statement with another sneer, but something about Miles's calm made her pause. For the first time, uncertainty flickered in her eyes, though she fought to bury it under her usual disdain. She cleared her throat. That's quite a claim, Mr. Donovan. And I suppose you have these so-called files hidden under a bridge somewhere? A faint, humorless smile tugged at Miles's lips. I have them stored securely, Your Honor, but I was close to retrieving a crucial piece of encrypted data at Apogee Tech. Before I could finish, security pinned me down. The prosecuting attorney leapt to his feet, face red. Your Honor, this is clearly a tactic to stall. We have clear footage. It shows me in the building, Miles interjected quietly, but it doesn't show what I was accessing. If your office actually checked the server logs at Apogee Tech, you'd see references to an unauthorized infiltration into a subfolder named Edify. That subfolder is restricted, locked behind multiple firewalls, used for testing their biometric scanning devices and back-end manipulations. All eyes turned to the prosecutor, who fumbled for words. The judge pounded her gavel for order, glaring at Miles. But behind her frustration was a tinge of curiosity. How do you know about this subfolder? She demanded. Miles' hand rested on the table, slender fingers gripping the edge. Because I built it, he said, voice steady. Years ago, A stunned silence descended upon the courtroom. The hush was broken by a smattering of gasps. Judge Aldridge's face froze in a mask of confusion, then incredulity. The prosecutor looked thunderstruck. "Explain," the judge finally managed, her tone subdued but razor-sharp. Miles swallowed, steeling himself as if this was the moment he dreaded for a long time. "I was once an engineer at Apogee Tech," he said quietly, "one of their lead software architects. I developed secure subfolders and encryption methods for a prototype program called Edify. But the program wasn't exactly what it claimed to be. Instead of a harmless data monitoring algorithm, it was designed to manipulate user data on a vast scale. Bank records, identification details, voting rolls. The aim was to create hidden backdoors for certain high-level clients. Eventually, I couldn't stomach it anymore, so I quit." Judge Aldridge stared down at him, an unreadable expression flickering across her face. "If you were truly a lead engineer," she said carefully, "then how did you end up like this?" Miles lowered his gaze, a haunted look settling in his eyes. "I tried to expose them," he replied, voice growing tighter. "I reached out to regulators, news outlets. Nobody wanted to listen. Or maybe they were paid off, I can't be sure. The blowback got me fired from the next 3 jobs. Apogee Tech blacklisted me, used my personal data to smear my name, freeze my bank accounts, paint me as incompetent. One by one, I lost everything, my home, my health insurance, my savings, until I became the man you see today." He paused, drawing a shaky breath. "I have no illusions about my situation, Your Honor. I know I look like a vagrant who can't keep his life together. But if you think I was stumbling around Apogee Tech for a warm place to sleep, you're wrong. I was just trying to finish what I started years ago, before it's too late." The courtroom was a powder keg of tension. Shock and skepticism dueled on every face. Even Judge Aldridge appeared momentarily speechless. She leaned back in her chair, glancing at the prosecutor, who was frantically flipping through pages, trying to find a rebuttal. Finally, regaining some measure of her usual scorn, the judge let out a snort. "You expect us to believe Apogee Tech is behind a massive data corruption conspiracy simply on your word? You've provided no tangible proof here today." Felicity Park spoke up, her tone small but insistent. "Your Honor, that's precisely why Mr. Donovan was attempting to retrieve the files. He's requested we subpoena Apogee Tech's server logs and security data. So far, the prosecution has refused." At those words, the prosecutor bristled, his cheeks flushing. "We didn't refuse. We simply stated there was no probable cause for such an intrusion into Apogee Tech's proprietary systems." "Proprietary systems," Felicity repeated, frustration lacing her voice. "They are the property of a private corporation, yes, but if they're being used for illegal data manipulation, the courts have the authority to investigate." Judge Aldridge rapped her gavel, looking decidedly uncomfortable. "This is all speculation. For the moment, Mr. Donovan is the one on trial." She let the statement hang as if that settled the matter. Miles inhaled slowly, and when he looked back up at her, his eyes held a glint of something fierce. "Your Honor," he said, voice carrying through the room, "if you truly seek justice, you'll check those logs. If you don't, you'll be complicit in letting a multi-billion-dollar corporation commit crimes against the very people this court is supposed to protect." A murmur swept through the crowd. The judge's nostrils flared. Something about Miles' words and steady manner unsettled her. He was not the usual disoriented homeless defendant she could dismiss with a wave of her hand. There was a steel in him, hidden beneath all that grimy clothing, a steel that sparkled like a newly unsheathed blade. She could have threatened him with contempt, she could have thrown him in jail on the spot, but some instinct stayed her hand. Instead, she cleared her throat, glancing at the clock on the wall. "We'll take a brief recess," she declared, voice echoing. "Court will reconvene in 30 minutes. I need to review some details." With that, she banged her gavel and rose, stepping down from the bench. People erupted into chatter as Miles was guided out by the bailiffs. Speculations fluttered in the air like a flock of startled birds. Was this homeless man telling the truth? Could a giant corporation like Apogee Tech really be behind such a grand conspiracy? Miles kept his head low, ignoring the stares. As he was led away, he noticed the prosecutor making a hurried phone call. Even from a distance, Miles recognized the anxious expression on the man's face. He's calling someone at Apogee Tech, Miles thought grimly. They'll want to bury this. Or bury me. In the cramped holding room, Miles sat down on a bench, elbows resting on his knees. Felicity hovered near him, adjusting her glasses. She looked more nervous than he felt. "Miles," she began softly, "I've never seen Judge Aldridge so rattled. You really got under her skin. Are you sure about all of this? If we push for an investigation and come up empty, they'll crucify us in court." He gave a weary smile. "I know what I saw at Apogee Tech. I helped design pieces of it. That's how I recognized when they pivoted to something sinister. This isn't just about me, Felicity. It's about thousands of people whose data's being compromised every day." She searched his face, finding only unwavering conviction. Finally, she nodded. "I'll file a motion to subpoena at once, but we need more evidence than your word, or even your partial knowledge. We need something concrete." Miles let out a low breath. "In my bag," he said, motioning to the plastic sack the bailiffs had confiscated. "There's a flash drive with fragments of code I managed to copy. I was hoping to piece together the rest that night. If we can decrypt it, we might have a chance." Felicity straightened, a spark of determination lighting her eyes. "I'll do everything I can." They exchanged a somber look. Neither said it out loud, but they both knew how dangerous this path could be. Apogee Tech wasn't just a random company. It was a titan, rumored to have high-level political ties. Outside in the hallway, the judge's recess was running. A few journalists were already typing furiously on their phones, sending out social media updates about the homeless man's extraordinary claim. Some bystanders whispered about how crazy it sounded, others how brave. And somewhere in a quiet corner, the prosecuting attorney barked orders into his phone. When court resumed, the judge wore an expression of forced composure, but tension radiated from her every movement. She settled back onto the bench, hands clasped. Her gaze flickered toward the defense table. Miles stood behind it, Felicity at his side, both defiant and worn. Clearing her throat, Judge Aldrich announced, "I've decided to hear additional arguments. The defense requests a subpoena of Apogee Tech's digital records relating to this Edify subfolder. The prosecution opposes it on grounds of irrelevance. Let's discuss." The prosecutor rose, looking much more guarded than before. "Your Honor, the defendant is simply spinning tales to distract from his crimes. Apogee Tech has no record of employing a Miles Donovan in any capacity that would grant him knowledge of such top-level encryption. Furthermore," Miles closed his eyes for a moment. He had anticipated exactly this maneuver. They would pretend he never existed. "Objection," Felicity said, her voice stronger now. "We have enough to show probable cause for an investigation. Mr. Donovan's fingerprints should be on any significant code contributions if he was truly on their development team. Additionally, we have a partial record from a prior paycheck stub that references Apogee Tech, though incomplete. We request discovery to verify or refute these claims properly." Judge Aldrich steepled her fingers under her chin, her gaze darting between both sides. She hesitated, as if waging an internal battle. Apogee Tech had deep pockets and formidable lawyers. Taking them on would be a monumental effort. But to ignore the possibility of a major corporate crime would tarnish the court's reputation. Her reputation. She sighed, reached for her gavel, and delivered a measured statement. I am granting the defense's request for a subpoena of certain limited records related to Mr. Donovan's alleged employment and the Edify subfolder. However, this matter will remain sealed pending preliminary review. I do not want a media circus." A ripple of shock spread across the room. The prosecution looked livid. Miles felt a flicker of relief. One step closer to the truth. But he knew it wouldn't be that easy. "Court is adjourned until the subpoena returns results," the judge added coolly. "Bail is set at $2,000. It was a sum Miles couldn't pay if he lived 3 lifetimes on the streets. He resigned himself to returning to jail to await the next hearing. The clang of the gavel echoed in his ears. A swirl of conversations and abrupt movements erupted as spectators filed out. Felicity gave him an apologetic look. "I'll file to have the bail reduced if we can't raise it. Don't lose hope." Miles simply nodded. He was marched away, a pair of handcuffs once again fastening around his wrists. The comedic cruelty wasn't lost on him. The man who had once developed the security measures that world-class corporations relied on was now locked in shackles, brandished through the courthouse like a spectacle. But as he disappeared into the corridor, a single reassuring thought hardened in his mind. The judge couldn't ignore his story anymore. The subpoena was real. Now Apogitech would have to respond. And that was when the real trouble would begin. They locked Miles up in a small local detention facility while the legal gears turned. Days crawled by. Felicity visited once, anxious, informing him that Apogitech's high-powered attorneys filed a motion to quash the subpoena. The legal wrangling was fierce. Meanwhile, the press caught wind of the story. A local news channel ran a short segment about the homeless conspiracy theorist, making Miles seem like a hapless fool. Inside his cell, Miles sat cross-legged on the narrow cot, ignoring the leers of other inmates. He meditated. He visualized lines of code in his head, trying to recapture the labyrinthine architecture of Edify's encryptions. He whispered to himself, "Resilience is born of adversity," a phrase his mother had often repeated when he was growing up. That quote carried him through each freezing night on the streets, and it carried him now. 5 days later, a rattling at his cell door snapped him out of his mental labyrinth. A guard with weary eyes gestured at him. "You made bail," he said gruffly. Miles froze. "That's impossible." The guard shrugged, unlocking the cell. "Somebody posted it, that's all I know. Pack your things." All Miles owned was the threadbare set of clothes he had worn to court. He followed the guard down a dim corridor, the clang of metal doors echoing behind them. At the front desk, a bored clerk handed him the plastic bag with his possessions. He wondered if Felicity had somehow pulled off a miracle, but she never mentioned any donors or charitable organizations stepping forward. When he walked out the main doors onto the street, the late afternoon sun felt blinding after so many days in a cement box. Blinking, Miles looked around. Then he saw her, Judge Aldridge, leaning against a sleek black sedan. Her hair was down this time, and she wore a plain gray coat. She lifted her head as soon as she spotted him. He tensed, unsure what to expect. For a moment, neither spoke. Then she took a measured step forward. "Miles," she said quietly, letting his name hang in the crisp air. There was no sign of the contempt she displayed in the courtroom. Instead, she looked almost human. "I posted your bail." Miles blinked, the world spinning slightly. "Why?" She ran a hand through her hair, looking away for a moment. "Because something happened. I reviewed a sealed statement from Apogee Tech. There were inconsistencies I couldn't ignore. And I started digging." Her voice wavered, the judge in her momentarily overshadowed by the curious woman. "I pulled your old tax records. You were listed as an independent software contractor for them, at least for a short time. There's a reference to a project with a partial name, ED something. So it's not just wild imagination. They tried to bury it. The question is why." A swirl of unexpected relief and caution meshed in Miles's chest. Judge Aldridge was the last person he expected to be an ally. Only a few days ago she had ridiculed him. Now, here she was, seemingly risking her own position. "You're not exactly known for empathy," Miles finally said, his voice thick with suspicion. She exhaled, a mist of cold breath in the evening air. "I don't have empathy for criminals," she replied curtly. "But I respect the law above all else. If a man might be innocent, and if a corporation might be exploiting the public, then I cannot in good conscience ignore that." Her words echoed between them, and for once Miles saw sincerity in her eyes. She glanced down at his ragged attire. "You can't fight this battle alone. If Apogee Tech's wrongdoing is real, you'll need every shred of help you can get, including from me." Miles swallowed, remembering the sting of her laughter in court. But the memory clashed with what stood before him now. An official who might actually believe him, or at least be curious enough to keep him alive. Because that was the real threat, wasn't it? Apogee Tech wouldn't just bury evidence. It would bury him if it felt threatened enough. "How do I know this isn't a trick?" he asked softly. Judge Aldridge's eyes flashed. "You don't. But I just paid $2,000 to get you out of that cell, so maybe give me the benefit of the doubt." A flicker of humor tugged at the corner of his mouth. For a moment he glimpsed something almost likable in her candor. Then he sighed. "Thank you." She nodded, stepping aside to open the passenger door. "Get in." Miles hesitated, glancing up and down the street. No sign of police, no sign of reporters. He could just walk away, disappear again. It was tempting, but something inside urged him to take this risk. If she was offering help, it might be the only chance to reveal the truth before Apogee Tech sealed every digital door. He climbed in, the softness of the seat jarringly foreign compared to the filthy mats he usually slept on. She slid into the driver's side and started the engine without a word. As the car wove through the city streets, neither spoke for several minutes. The silence was broken only by the hum of traffic and the beep of pedestrian crossings. Finally, she cleared her throat. "I reviewed the initial sealed subpoena response," she said, glancing at him briefly. "Apogee Tech claims no knowledge of any subfolder named Edify. They even provided partial server logs." Miles scoffed. "Fake logs, obviously. They probably have entire teams forging that data." She nodded, grim. The response was oddly thorough, too thorough. "They're definitely hiding something. I've set a second hearing next week, but they're likely to fight the subpoena to the Supreme Court if we push too hard. That could drag on for months, plenty of time for them to erase everything." Miles rubbed his temple, frustration churning inside him. "We need proof faster than that. And we need the real logs." She took a sharp right turn, the car entering a quieter district of the city, lined with weathered warehouses and shuttered storefronts. Night was falling fast, casting elongated shadows. The judge pulled into a deserted parking lot behind an abandoned workshop, then cut the engine. "We won't be disturbed here," she said, sounding almost conspiratorial. "Now, tell me exactly what you know about Edify from the beginning. If I'm going to risk my career, I need the full picture." Miles inhaled deeply, summoning memories he'd tried to bury. "The original assignment was pitched as a data aggregator for social media metrics," he began. "They told me it would just track user preferences to build better online experiences. But as I coded the subroutines, I realized they were inserting additional layers. Key logging functions, location tracking, cross-referencing personal IDs with financial institutions. I objected, but my superiors said it was a standard security measure. I didn't buy it." Judge Aldridge listened intently, her expression darkening. "So this was surveillance on a massive scale?" He nodded. "Yes, and more. They wanted to be able to adjust data at its source, like editing someone's bank balance or even their social security info, without leaving a trace. That's not just surveillance, it's control. You can ruin someone's life with a few keystrokes, or 1,000 people's lives, or an entire election cycle. She exhaled sharply. My God. Miles's voice caught. When I tried to go public, the attorneys threatened me. Then odd discrepancies popped up in my own records. My credit cards were canceled, jobs withdrew offers, even my apartment lease was suddenly voided. I had nowhere to go. I ended up living on the streets, and every attempt I made to blow the whistle fell on deaf ears. The judge's knuckles whitened around the steering wheel. And you still have some of this code? In pieces, Miles replied. He encrypted. But to prove it beyond doubt, we need the master logs from Apogee-Tech's servers. She closed her eyes briefly, as if grappling with the enormity of it. When she opened them, they blazed with a determined fire. We have to act quickly, she said. My authority can only go so far. Apogee-Tech's lawyers will drag the courts through endless motions. By the time a final order is issued, the evidence might be gone. Miles gave a bitter laugh. Exactly. And with their money, they can buy nearly any politician, hush any media outlet. She studied him quietly. So what do you propose we do? He hesitated, then leaned forward. I know a back door. It was a fail-safe I built into Edify, my personal override if something went wrong. If it still exists, I can bypass their firewall and retrieve the unaltered logs, but I'd need a secure environment to do it. The judge's eyes widened. You want to hack into Apogee-Tech again? This time with me knowing? Technically, Miles said carefully, it would be an unsanctioned retrieval of legally relevant data, but it might be the only way to expose them. He could see the judge weigh her sense of duty against her fear. She let out a shaky breath. I can't authorize illegal activity. If we get caught, she trailed off, imagining the scandal, the career-ending blow. But if your story is true, it might be the only moral choice. She shook her head in disbelief. This is insane. A flicker of hope stirred in Miles's chest. It's insane, yes, he agreed quietly. But it's also the truth. And sometimes the truth demands a heavy price. He paused, remembering a quote his father used to recite from time to time. Truth is like the sun. You can shut it out for a time, but it ain't going away. It felt more relevant now than ever. Judge Aldridge's expression turned resolute. All right, but we can't do it alone. I have a friend, a forensic IT specialist who works unofficially with the district attorney's office sometimes. I trust him. If we bring him on board, maybe we can find a safer way to do this. Miles nodded, relief flooding him. After years of fighting in isolation, he finally had an ally in a place of real power. It wasn't perfect and the stakes were colossal, but it was a start. She handed him a cell phone. For now, keep this on you. It's an unregistered phone. Contact me at that number only. And, Mr. Donovan, if you ever planned on skipping town, this wouldn't be the time. Miles managed a small, grateful smile. I'm not running anymore, he said. I want justice. She stared at him a moment longer, then started the engine. Let's do this before either of us chickens out. 2 nights later, well past midnight, an unmarked van idled in a deserted parking structure a few blocks from Apogee-Tech's headquarters. Judge Aldridge sat in the driver's seat, scanning the perimeter. Next to her, a lean, middle-aged man named Oscar Kim typed furiously on a laptop. His hair was graying at the temples, and he wore a plain black hoodie that gave him a tired, world-weary appearance. Miles sat in the back, hunched over his own laptop. They had set up a makeshift command center. Portable Wi-Fi, encrypted channels, a generator humming softly. The judge occasionally wiped her sweaty palms on her slacks, heart pounding. She was a respected figure on the bench, and here she was, about to break into a corporate server with the help of a homeless whistleblower and an off-the-books IT specialist. Oscar turned to Miles. "All right," he murmured. "The system's prepped. You sure you can do this from here?" Miles nodded, his posture tense but his voice steady. "If my old override still exists, I only need a stable connection. Then I can pivot through a series of subnets to mask our origin. Apogee Tech's firewall is advanced, but the override was built from within. That's our edge." Judge Aldridge's nerves were frayed. She found herself repeating a mantra in her head. Justice demands sacrifice. She recalled a quote from her law school days. "In matters of truth and justice, there is no difference between large and small problems, for issues concerning the treatment of people are all the same." Somehow that brought her a sliver of calm. "All right, do it," she said, her voice oddly breathy. Miles took a steadying breath, then typed a command sequence. Lines of code scrolled across the screen. A moment later he found the old backdoor port, labeled with a cryptic phrase he'd embedded years ago. Chronos. He typed in a key phrase. Sperlusem 451. For a tense second nothing happened. Then a spark of recognition flashed on the screen. A small window popped up, prompting a password. Miles's chest tightened. This was the final step. He had created it as a last resort. The password was only in his memory, a phrase of personal significance. He typed, DCIRE 3267. The moment he pressed enter, the laptop whirred. Screen after screen of data blossomed into view. He was in. Oscar let out a low whistle. "You weren't kidding." Judge Aldridge felt her heart lurch. This was the turning point. Either they'd find the proof or blow their last chance. "Hurry," she urged in a whisper. "They might detect us any second." Miles navigated quickly, searching for the Edify subfolder. The structure had changed since he last saw it, but certain footprints remained. Then, hidden behind layers of decoy files, he found it. Edify_MA. He opened it and saw a labyrinth of subfolders, each named with coded references. Ganymede, Tethys, Titan. Inside them a tangled web of logs, hashed files, program scripts, and ironically, a dummy folder labeled 4_review. That was likely the one Apogee Tech had handed over during their subpoena response. "Accessing the real logs now," Miles muttered. "There's an entire directory of flagged user data, over 500,000 lines referencing individuals." His eyes scanned the details. Personal IDs, timestamps, financial adjustments, location pings. It was worse than he'd imagined. Apogee Tech wasn't just capable of infiltration, it was actively altering data on a widespread scale. The logs were meticulously hidden, but real. Finally, he opened the root script for Edify. A text file displayed on the screen. Its lines an admission of corporate malfeasance in cold clinical code. Judge Aldridge leaned forward from the driver's seat, eyes wide with horror. This is an instruction set for how to manipulate bank balances on demand." Oscar's breathing quickened. "Look at the timestamps. They've been doing test runs on random accounts, people's entire savings being zeroed out, then set back to normal, probably to ensure no one notices short changes." My God. Miles clenched his jaw. They're a step away from being able to rewrite people's finances, entire histories, at will. A spike of adrenaline shot through the van. This was the smoking gun. Judge Aldridge realized in that moment that everything Miles had said, everything she'd once mocked, was real. The chill seeping into her bones wasn't just the night air. It was the dread of confronting how deeply technology could warp justice if left unchecked. "Copy it all," she ordered. "Every file, every log." Miles nodded, beginning a massive data transfer. Outside, the city lights glimmered, oblivious to the digital heist happening in this nondescript parking lot. Each passing second felt like an hour. They could almost hear the mechanical hum of Apogee Tech's security engines searching for the unauthorized connection. Suddenly an alarm blinked on Oscar's screen. "They've detected us," he hissed. They're running an internal trace, trying to shut down ports. We've got maybe a minute before they sever the link." "Just a little longer," Miles muttered, watching the progress bar inch across the screen. 78%? 79%? Oscar's eyes flicked to the rear-view mirror. "We've got company," he said. Judge Aldridge peered out. A sleek black SUV was rolling slowly into the parking structure, headlights off. A jolt of fear shot through her. "We need to move," she urged, turning the ignition key. The van roared to life. 90%? 91%? The black SUV accelerated, squealing around a corner. The judge slammed her foot on the gas. The van lurched forward, nearly throwing Miles off the bench. But he clutched the laptop, determined to keep the connection alive until the transfer finished. Oscar, in the passenger seat, pulled out a phone and dialed 911, his voice hushed but urgent. "This is an emergency. We're being followed in the Park Street garage." He cursed. The line went dead. "They jammed the signal." Judge Aldridge whipped the steering wheel, ascending the ramp to the upper level. The black SUV thundered behind them. She saw armed silhouettes in the driver's seat, probably Apogee Tech's private security or hired muscle. The entire operation had just escalated to a matter of life and death. Miles's eyes flicked to the laptop screen. 98%, 99%, complete. He breathed a sigh of relief. "I've got it. We can sever the connection. Let's get the hell out." Oscar slammed the laptop shut. "Hang on," he called to the judge. "Lose them if you can." She grit her teeth. "I'm a judge, not a stunt driver," she muttered. But adrenaline took over and she yanked the wheel hard, racing around the top level of the garage, heading for the exit. The van's tires screeched, echoing ominously. The SUV was right behind them, lights flashing like some twisted predator. A gunshot rang out. The back window of the van shattered. Miles ducked instinctively, arms protecting his head. Shards of glass showered the interior, glinting like cruel rain. "Keep your head down," the judge barked. She steered violently, trying to circle to the downward ramp. Another shot ricocheted off the metal side of the van, leaving a dent. Miles's heart hammered as he realized just how far Apogee Tech was willing to go to protect its secrets. They reached the downward spiral, tires screaming as they descended. The SUV tried to block the exit, but Judge Aldridge accelerated, slamming into the side of the black vehicle. The impact threw them sideways. Sparks flew, metal groaned. But the judge wrenched the wheel, scraping past the SUV in a shower of sparks, and the van burst onto the street. Oscar twisted in his seat. "They're still behind us?" Miles clutched the laptop like a lifeline. The precious data, the only chance at saving thousands of people from invisible manipulation. Another shot rang out. This time, the bullet lodged in the van's door. Judge Aldridge steered with iron determination, weaving through empty streets. She glanced at Miles in the mirror. "Upload the data somewhere safe, now." Miles fumbled, flipping open the device. In the swirl of panic and roaring engines, he tethered to the phone they had, typing a command to send the zipped folder of evidence to multiple secure cloud servers. Oscar risked a look out the shattered back window. "They're gaining on us. We won't outrun them in this old van." "You're just another few seconds," Miles muttered as the progress bar on the uploads advanced. The phone signal flickered. Whoever was chasing them still jammed the line, but it wasn't a perfect jam. He found partial connectivity. 25%, 26%. A bullet shattered the side mirror. Glass rained down. Judge Aldridge let out a furious hiss, swerving to dodge an abandoned car. The SUV rammed into their rear bumper, nearly sending the van spinning. Oscar gripped the dashboard. "They're trying to force us to crash?" Miles's heart thudded. 60%, 70%. Judge Aldridge scanned the street ahead. "We're approaching the harbor," she said. "There might be a chance to lose them on the docks, but if they corner us, we'll have to take that risk," Miles said, sweat beading on his brow. He typed furiously, ignoring the chaos around him. 85%, 90%? The van lurched again as the SUV collided with them, nearly throwing the laptop from Miles's grasp. He clutched it for dear life, his breath ragged. A third shot rang out, punching a hole through the rear door. The judge veered left, tires squealing like tortured animals, racing down a slope that led to the deserted waterfront. "Almost there," Miles gasped. The signal flickered again, but the bar inched forward. 96%, 97%. The SUV roared closer, its grille looming in the broken back window. Then the final beep signaled the uploads completed. Instantly, Miles typed a quick encryption key to lock the data, so only Felicity, Judge Aldridge, and a few trusted recipients could access it. "It's done," he shouted, relief warring with terror. Judge Aldridge slammed on the brakes, spinning the wheel. The van fishtailed wildly on the wet dock pavement, and the SUV overshot them, skidding past. Before the men in black could reverse, she gunned the engine, racing away into a side alley near a line of warehouses. Oscar exhaled in shaky triumph. "They've lost us, for now. Let's not stick around." They sped through the narrow lanes, headlights off, hearts pounding. A minute later, the harbor was behind them, and the black SUV was nowhere in sight. Only when they reached a main road crowded with night transport trucks did the judge finally let out a long, ragged breath. "We did it," she said, voice taut with both fear and exhilaration. "We have the files. We have proof." Miles clung to the seat, body trembling. Relief spread like a slow tide. For the first time in years, he wasn't alone or powerless. They had the evidence. Now they just had to survive to use it. Oscar glanced back at the bullet holes in the van. "They'll be looking for us. Let's find a safe place to lay low and plan our next move." Judge Aldridge's hands shook on the steering wheel. She gripped it tight to hide her terror. "I know somewhere we can go," she said. "A friend of mine runs a small lakeside lodge up north, closed for the season. We'll regroup there." Miles gazed out the shattered window, a swirl of adrenaline still in his veins. It was insane. He was a homeless ex-employee partnered with a sitting judge, having just stolen back his own code from a corporate giant that wanted him dead. Yet in this insane moment, hope felt more alive than ever. He remembered another quote he'd once read. "In the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends." This time he had found allies who refused to stay silent. Perhaps that was enough to finally tip the scales of justice. The following days passed in a blur of secrecy and strategy. The lakeside lodge was a modest wooden structure overlooking a sprawling body of water. In the off-season, nobody visited, and the caretaker was a discreet acquaintance of Judge Aldridge, who asked no questions. Inside a candlelit parlor, they set up a makeshift war room. Miles, Judge Aldridge, and Oscar pored over the data they'd secured, cross-referencing logs, analyzing code, building a bulletproof case. The more they discovered, the darker the picture became. Apogee Tech wasn't just dabbling in identity tampering, it was actively selling the capacity for large-scale data manipulation to shadowy buyers around the world. One particularly damning file revealed a contract with an unnamed private interest group, referencing an upcoming election. Even Judge Aldridge, who prided herself on her stoicism, looked physically ill reading the lines of code that orchestrated how to tilt a digital ballot. This was not some petty theft or clandestine peeking. This was an assault on democracy itself. "We have to go public," Oscar said one morning, eyes bloodshot from sleepless nights. "This is bigger than any single court case. People need to know." Judge Aldrich closed her laptop, massaging her temples. "The moment we go public, Apogee Tech will declare war. You saw how they reacted just to us hacking their server. They'll file injunctions, call in political favors. Our best bet is to coordinate with multiple media outlets at once. Release everything in a tidal wave so it can't be buried or discredited." Miles nodded. "I've got the data stored on multiple encrypted drives. If we deliver it simultaneously to major news networks, plus official government watchdogs, they can't silence it all. Oscar rubbed his chin thoughtfully. And we'll need Felicity. She can coordinate the legal side, ensuring the chain of custody is documented. Otherwise, Apogee Tech will accuse us of fabrication. Judge Aldridge stood, determination blazing in her eyes. Let's do it. But we must be careful. If Apogee Tech's influence runs as deep as we suspect, we could be blocked at every turn. They sprang into action. Miles contacted Felicity via their secure channel. Overjoyed and terrified, she agreed to gather reliable journalists, people not afraid to tackle a corporate titan. Meanwhile, Judge Aldridge prepared an official statement, verifying the authenticity of the data from a legal standpoint, though she too risked her career by doing so. Oscar orchestrated the digital release plan, setting up an automatic distribution to multiple outlets. Late one evening, everything was ready. Miles sat on a bench outside the lodge, staring at the moonlight dancing on the water's surface. The crisp night air stung his lungs, and the quiet hum of insects soothed his battered nerves. For years he had felt like a ghost, drifting from corner to corner, overshadowed by Apogee Tech's unstoppable power. Now he had a real chance to bring them down. Judge Aldridge walked out, joining him on the bench. She was silent for a moment, then spoke softly. "I misjudged you," she said, her voice carrying a weight of remorse. "When I saw you in that courtroom, all I could see was a man who'd wasted his life. I never imagined you were fighting a secret war." Miles offered a faint smile. "I understand. I hardly look like a hero." He gestured at his ragged jacket, still smelling faintly of diesel and fear. "Sometimes life breaks you down so much you forget you're still human. And you're not the first to laugh or dismiss me." She hesitated, folding her hands in her lap. "I was raised to believe that if people tried hard enough, they wouldn't end up on the streets, that it was a matter of self-discipline and moral fiber. But now I see how a corporation like Apogee Tech can systematically strip a person of everything: livelihood, reputation, dignity, without leaving a single fingerprint." A tear glinted in the corner of her eye, though she quickly blinked it away. "I'm sorry," she whispered, "for judging you before I knew the truth." Miles met her gaze. "Thank you for admitting that," he said quietly. He felt a peculiar warmth in his chest, as if part of him that had been numb for years was thawing at last. "I appreciate you standing up now, when it matters most." She nodded, then cleared her throat, slipping back into her familiar authoritative tone. "Let's make sure your story ends differently than it began." At precisely 9 a.m. the next morning, 3 major news networks, an independent investigative website, and a national consumer advocacy group received the entire trove of Edify documents. Judge Aldridge transmitted her signed affidavit verifying the collection and explaining its significance. Felicity prepared injunctions guaranteeing that Apogee Tech could not simply muzzle the press with lawsuits. The reaction was explosive. Within hours, Edify leak trended on social media, overshadowing every other headline. Talk shows brought on experts to discuss the ramifications of a system that could manipulate bank balances and personal identities. Senatorial committees announced immediate inquiries. Whistleblower support hotlines lit up with calls. Apogee Tech's stock plummeted. Corporate spokespeople rushed to issue denials, labeling the data as fraudulent, but the credibility of the judge's affidavit and the sheer volume of cross-verified logs quickly dispelled any illusions. It was real, and it was monstrous. By midday, a swarm of reporters camped outside Apogee Tech's gleaming tower, cameras rolling, demanding statements. A few daring journalists even suggested class action lawsuits, spurred on by new revelations of data tampering. And while Apogee Tech's legal behemoths scrambled, the unstoppable truth hammered at their fortress from every angle. Miles watched it unfold on the small TV set inside the lodge's dusty common room. He couldn't help but feel awe. For the first time in memory, he saw a wave of righteousness powerful enough to shake even the mightiest corporation. The battered man he used to be, the man huddled under cardboard in an alley, felt like another lifetime. Judge Aldridge paced behind him, phone in hand. Every few minutes she received calls, journalists, colleagues, even a couple of politicians. She answered carefully, providing neutral statements yet refusing to back down. Oscar was glued to his laptop, monitoring the public response in real time. Felicity, on speakerphone, kept them updated on the legal labyrinth forming around Apogee Tech. Suddenly, one of Felicity's updates brought Miles's heart pounding into his throat. "We've just heard that federal agents have launched an investigation," she said, excitement tangling with worry. "They're securing Apogee Tech's building as we speak." Miles stared at the phone, hardly believing it. "So that means they can't just destroy the logs?" "You," Felicity confirmed. "If the feds do their job right, they'll preserve everything for official review. This is huge, Miles." Judge Aldridge ended the call with a tired but genuine smile. "We did it. We forced their hand." Oscar sank into a chair, letting out a long breath. "I can't believe it. We might have actually won." A hush fell over them, the tension melting into a quiet sense of relief. Outside, the sun shone on the lake's surface, glimmering like a beacon of hope. Miles stepped onto the porch, letting the crisp air wash over him. He closed his eyes, thinking of the sleepless nights on concrete, the scornful looks he'd endured, the nights he believed he might die of exposure or starve. He had carried the truth inside him for so long, battered by a system that refused to believe him. Yet here he stood, not just surviving, but triumphant. Judge Aldrich joined him, adjusting the collar of her coat. She studied his profile for a moment. "You realize," she said softly, "this isn't over. Apogee Tech will fight the charges in court. They'll try to blame rogue employees or claim ignorance. They might even come after you in other ways." Miles exhaled slowly. "I know. But at least now I'm not alone and the world is watching. That changes everything." She nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. "I've already seen calls from attorneys offering pro bono services to represent you in any future case. Turns out, the hero of the Ediphileaks has a lot of supporters." Miles chuckled, the sound rusty with emotion. "Hero," he repeated, shaking his head. "I'm just a man who refused to keep quiet." "Sometimes," she said gently, "that's exactly what a hero is." They stood there a while in companionable silence, watching the sunlight ripple over the water. Somewhere in the distance, a loon called across the lake, its haunting cry a reminder of nature's indomitable voice, a voice that cannot be silenced. Eventually the judge spoke up again. "Once the dust settles, you should consider pressing charges of your own against Apogee Tech for what they did to you, for the defamation and blacklisting." Miles shrugged, a mix of weariness and cautious hope. "Maybe. Right now, I'm just trying to process that I'm free." She placed a hand on his shoulder, a gesture of quiet respect. "Freedom is a precious thing, Mr. Donovan. Don't ever let anyone take it from you again." His eyes drifted back to the horizon, the sun shimmering like a promise of better days. He recalled a line from a half-forgotten philosopher. "A single act of courage can ripple through time, changing the course of history." It resonated in his mind, filling him with a sense of purpose. Yes, he might face trials ahead, and Apogee Tech would not surrender without a fight. But the fortress had been breached, the truth was out. And sometimes, that first step, illuminating the darkness, is enough to topple even the most towering giant. Days later, the city was a hotbed of demonstrations, press conferences, and swirling rumors. Federal investigators seized Apogee Tech's internal servers. High-ranking executives were subpoenaed. Citizens gathered outside government buildings, demanding comprehensive reforms to prevent future data manipulation. Miles became a reluctant public figure, dubbed by some outlets as the homeless whistleblower. Footage of him leaving the courthouse in shackles, played alongside images of him meeting with investigators, no longer a prisoner, but a key witness. The public devoured every detail of his story, an engineer undone by corporate greed, only to rise again when justice needed him most. Judge Aldrich, for her part, faced a disciplinary review for her extrajudicial involvement. Yet, as the scope of the scandal exploded, she garnered surprising support from ethical committees praising her moral courage. The outcome was uncertain, but her unwavering stance made many reevaluate their opinions of her once harsh demeanor. Oscar quietly continued providing technical insights to the federal task force, often referencing Miles's code to show exactly how Edify had functioned. Felicity juggled an onslaught of phone calls, from potential plaintiffs wanting to join class action lawsuits, to journalists hungry for every new revelation. In a world so often overshadowed by corruption and cynicism, the Edify leak scandal rekindled a sense of public hope. Ordinary people found themselves moved by the simple truth that even a man at rock bottom could expose a titan when driven by conviction. And at the heart of it all was Miles Donovan, no longer just a ragged figure on the streets. He testified in multiple hearings, his calm demeanor rattling corporate lawyers who once believed him too insignificant to matter. Their earlier attempts to deny his existence crumbled under the tidal wave of evidence. Each day, Apogee Tech's stranglehold on the narrative weakened. Each day, more insiders stepped forward, emboldened by Miles's example, revealing further layers of corruption. When the final day of initial testimony arrived, a hush fell over the packed courtroom. This time Miles stood at the plaintiff's table, wearing donated dress pants and a pressed shirt. The transformation was striking. He no longer resembled a destitute outcast, but a dignified man who had wrestled with adversity and come out stronger. Judge Aldrich observed from the bench, though she was technically recused from ruling on the case. She watched as miles of complicated data, logs, and corporate memos were laid bare. She saw the stunned faces of the public, the humbled corporate representatives, and she remembered the first time she'd seen Miles Donovan standing before her, so certain she was dealing with just another. He delivered his final statement, voice clear, resonating through the silent chamber. I was homeless, not because I was lazy or lacked skill, but because I dared to challenge a power so immense it nearly consumed me. Apogee Tech tried to erase me, smear me, leave me voiceless on the streets. But truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deep you bury it. I stand before you today, not as a victim, but as a testament to the fact that one voice, when persistent enough, can make the walls of injustice tremble. The courtroom erupted into applause. Unorthodox but unstoppable, cameras flashed, capturing the moment. Outside, protest signs waved under bright sunshine. Headlines would soon read, "Homeless Whistleblower's Triumphant Final Words." Epilogue, Lessons Learned. In the weeks and months that followed, lawsuits piled up against Apogee Tech. Government oversight committees began drafting legislation aimed at preventing corporate abuses of personal data. Several executives resigned in disgrace. A few faced criminal charges. And while the wheels of justice turned slowly, they were turning in the right direction. Miles Donovan, for his part, was offered multiple new job opportunities in the tech sector. He accepted a position with a small cybersecurity firm dedicated to ethical data practices. The thought of once again handling code no longer filled him with dread. It filled him with renewed purpose. Judge Aldrich, after an initial period of scrutiny, was ultimately commended for her integrity in safeguarding crucial evidence. Though her methods were unconventional, the public recognized the moral courage it took to stand up for the greater good, even when it meant bending certain procedures. She continued her duties on the bench with a deeper empathy, especially for those society cast aside. And so, from a single spark, one ragged man's refusal to stay silent, A fire of truth spread across an entire nation. In reflecting on the saga, several profound life lessons emerged. 1. Persistence in the face of overwhelming odds. It does not matter how slowly you go as long as you do not stop, an old adage goes. Miles embodied this principle. Even when he was stripped of his home, credibility, and resources, he clung to the truth, refusing to let the machinery of corruption snuff out his voice. 2. The power of allies. Alone, Miles could only do so much. But with Felicity's legal support, Oscar's technical skills, and Judge Aldridge's eventual turn of conscience, their collective effort toppled a giant. True strength often arises not from one hero, but from many people uniting for the same cause. 3. Never underestimate the unseen. Appearances can be deceiving. The homeless figure you pass on the sidewalk might carry knowledge or secrets that could reshape the world. Judge Aldridge's initial scorn toward Miles stands as a reminder that dismissing people based on outward signs can blind us to genuine insight or integrity. 4. Truth as an unstoppable force. Pagetek tried every tactic to bury the truth: legal threats, falsified records, even violence. Yet, once revealed, the truth spread with a momentum that no amount of money or power could contain. It was, in the words of one philosopher, like light shining in a dark place, driving out shadows everywhere it touched. 5. Hope and redemption. Miles's journey from the gutter to the forefront of a national reckoning exemplifies the resilience of the human spirit. No matter how dire the circumstances, redemption is possible if one remains steadfast to principle. The comeback is always stronger than the setback, a saying popular among those in middle-age rings, particularly true in Miles's transformation. In the end, while Pagetek's story would continue to unfold in courts and legislative halls, the immediate outcome stood as a beacon. The underdog had spoken, and the world had listened. The once homeless whistleblower won not just his own freedom, but also spearheaded a movement toward greater accountability in the digital age. Above all else, Miles Donovan's tale testifies that justice is not a relic found in the dusty corners of law books. It's a living, breathing ideal, forged and reforged by those courageous enough to challenge whatever stands in its way. And if a homeless man with nothing left to lose could stare down $1 billion empire, perhaps there's a little bit of that courage in each of us, waiting to stand up, speak out, and tip the scales of a world that so desperately needs it.